Paris, the autumn of 1789. A 16-year-old refuses to board a ship. Under French law, standing on French soil, she is already free. France has no institution of slavery, and any enslaved person who set foot there could petition the courts and walk away with legal standing behind them. Under Virginia law, where that ship is headed, she is property. Legally, functionally, on paper, property. Two systems, two truths, and she is standing exactly on the line between them. She is pregnant, and the man who owns her is the one asking her to come home. She does not run. Paris in 1789 is not a safe place to disappear into. A revolution is breaking out in the streets outside her window. The Bastille has just fallen, and running would mean vanishing into that chaos with nothing and no one. Instead, she names a price. According to the account her son would give decades later, she agreed to return only on one condition. Her children, all of them, including the ones not yet born, would be freed once they came of age. Thomas Jefferson agreed. Every child born from that agreement eventually walked free. She never did. Not officially, not on paper, not in her lifetime. She traded the one piece of leverage she would ever hold for people who did not exist yet. Quick pause before we go any further. Documentaries like this take obsessive research to build. No studio, no network, just a genuine commitment to stories that actually deserve to be told. We are aiming to hit 1,000 subscribers by the end of this month. If this story already has you, hit subscribe. Be one of the originals, the ones who were here before this channel took off. One click. That is all it takes. And drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you are watching from. I read every single one. We're almost there. Let's finish this together. There's a room at Monticello that visitors walked past for nearly 200 years. It sits beneath the south terrace, next to the kitchen, 12 feet by 14. No windows. For most of the 20th century, it functioned as a men's bathroom for tour visitors. It wasn't identified, restored, and opened to the public as Sally Hemings' living quarters until 2017. To understand what happened in that room, you have to go back one more generation, to a woman named Elizabeth Hemings. Elizabeth was enslaved by a Virginia planter named John Wales. After his third wife died, Wales began a relationship with Elizabeth that lasted more than a decade and produced 6 children, Sally among them, born in 1773. That single fact rearranges the whole story. It makes Sally Hemings the half-sister of Jefferson's own wife, Martha, who was Wales' daughter by an earlier marriage. When Wales died in 1773, Martha inherited the Hemings family along with roughly 135 other enslaved people and a mountain of debt. Sally was an infant at the time, carried into Monticello as part of an inheritance that also included her own mother and siblings. Here is the fact that historians eventually did the arithmetic on. The Hemings family did not enter Monticello as strangers acquired for field labor. They entered as blood relatives of the family that would own them for the next 2 generations, and the plantation's own records eventually made that relationship impossible to deny. The Hemingses were not treated like the roughly 130 other enslaved people at Monticello. They held the skilled indoor positions: cooks, seamstresses, a blacksmith, a carpenter, domestic servants inside the main house. The closest thing to privilege that existed inside a system built to deny it. Sally's older brother James trained in Paris as a French chef under Jefferson's own arrangement. Sally herself grew up as a companion to Jefferson's daughters, close enough to the family to be handed real responsibility, never close enough to be given any say in her own future. Consider Monticello from her position in it. Raised inside the house that owned her mother, taught skills that made her useful rather than free, watching relatives who looked like her family walk the same halls as people who legally were her family. She was 14 in 1787 when Jefferson, then serving as United States Minister to France, asked her to escort his 8-year-old daughter Maria across the Atlantic. She had no way of knowing what 2 years in Paris would do to the rest of her life. Paris did something to the arithmetic that Virginia never could. Under French law at the time, slavery had no clear legal standing on French soil, and an enslaved person who reached France could petition the courts for freedom. It wasn't automatic, and it wasn't guaranteed, but the principle existed, and enslaved people in France had successfully used it before. Sally Hemings, 14 and then 15 and then 16, was living for the first time somewhere the ground beneath her feet gave her a legal argument Virginia would never recognize. Her brother James was already there when she arrived, having accompanied Jefferson to Paris in 1784 to train as a chef. a skill Jefferson wanted for his own household, and one that gave James an unusually strong hand of his own. Jefferson eventually agreed to free him, on the condition that James first train a successor. Sally arrived 3 years later into a household where her own brother was, in effect, negotiating the terms of his freedom in real time. She was also, for the first stretch of her life, paid. Jefferson's own account books from Paris record wages disbursed to Sally Hemings for her work in his household. Modest sums, but money owed to her the way money is owed to a free person, not doled out as a mercy. In Virginia, nothing like that existed for her. Compensation for labor was a right extended to people the law recognized as capable of ownership, and she had never been called that. Here is the fact that historians eventually did the arithmetic on. By the time she turned 16, Sally Hemings had spent roughly 2 years living in a country where the law itself argued against her enslavement. The longest continuous stretch of legal ambiguity, and arguably freedom, she would experience in her entire life. Sometime during that period, Jefferson, then in his mid-40s, a widower for 5 years and her legal owner, began a sexual relationship with her. She became pregnant before the household's return to Virginia was finalized. That relationship, and everything built into it, a 3-decade age gap, his total legal and financial control over her, her almost total absence of any real alternative, is not a footnote to what follows. It is the center of it. Every decision she made afterward was downstream of the fact that she held almost no power at all, except one narrow, closing window, the French border, and a ship with a departure date. She had one card to play, and by every surviving account, she played it exactly once. According to Madison Hemings, her son, in an 1873 interview recorded by Ohio newspaper editor and published as his own first-hand account, Sally refused to return to Virginia unless Jefferson agreed to specific terms. Their children, once they reached adulthood, would be freed. Not conditionally. Not at Jefferson's future discretion. A promise, made to a 16-year-old in a foreign country, about people who did not exist yet. There is no letter recording this negotiation in either of their hands. No contemporaneous witness left an account of it. What survives is testimony passed down inside a family that had every reason to remember the terms precisely, because their entire future depended on Jefferson keeping his word. And because decades later, when Madison Hemings finally told his version publicly, it was one of the only times anyone in that family spoke about it on the record at all. Here is the fact that historians eventually did the arithmetic on. Jefferson kept it. All 4 of Sally Hemings' children who survived to adulthood, Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston, were ultimately freed, either informally released as adults during the 1820s or formally freed by name in Jefferson's 1826 will. Of everyone Jefferson enslaved over his lifetime, this is the only family line he freed in its entirety. She returned to Virginia in 1789, pregnant, 16 years old, bound by a private, unwritten agreement that Jefferson had every legal ability to break and simply chose, over the following decades, to honor for their children. Not for her. Some accounts suggest her first pregnancy did not survive infancy. The documented record picks back up with a daughter named Harriet, born in 1795, who also died young. A second Harriet was born in 1801, followed by Madison in 1805 and Eston in 1808. It would be more than a decade before any of them reached adulthood, and the terms of that Paris bargain were finally put to the test. When the test came, it played out in 2 very different ways. Beverly and the second Harriet chose to leave Monticello quietly in their early 20s and enter white society, a path their appearance made possible and their survival required. Madison and Eston took a different route. Both were formally named and freed in Jefferson's will, and both eventually settled in Ohio, where slavery was illegal. Madison worked as a carpenter and farmer, married, raised a family, and lived openly as a man of mixed race who never denied his parentage. Which is precisely why, in 1873, a local newspaper editor thought his story worth recording at all. Eston initially settled near his brother, then later moved his family further north, eventually changing his surname and living the remainder of his life as a white man. 2 brothers, raised in the same house by the same mother, made opposite choices about which parts of their own history to carry forward. And both choices were, in their own way, a direct consequence of what their mother bought them in Paris. For the next 37 years, Sally Hemings lived at Monticello, a short walk from the man who owned her and had fathered 6 of her children. Jefferson was, by nearly every surviving account, an affectionate and doting grandfather to his acknowledged white grandchildren through his daughter Martha, who ran freely through the main house and were educated, celebrated, and folded into Jefferson's public legacy. Sally Hemings' own children lived in the same household, some of them working inside it as they grew, and they appear in Jefferson's personal records not as sons and daughters but as line items, inventoried by name, age, and assessed monetary value. Here is the fact that historians eventually did the arithmetic on Jefferson's own farm book. The meticulous ledger in which he tracked the people, livestock, and crops of his plantation lists Sally Hemings and her children by name and age in the same columns and the same handwriting he used for his horses and his hogs. This wasn't a private secret confined to Monticello's hillside. In 1802, a journalist named James Callender, a former political ally of Jefferson's turned bitter enemy, published the allegation publicly in a Richmond newspaper, making Sally Hemings' name and her relationship to Jefferson a national scandal in his own lifetime. Jefferson never publicly confirmed or denied it. For most of the next 2 centuries, mainstream historians treated Callender's account as unreliable partisan slander and largely dismissed it, despite the fact that the Hemings family itself had never stopped telling its own version of the story. The chamber, the small room off the south terrace, the wardrobe she kept there, the children, growing up a floor away from cousins who never had to hide anything, sewing, weaving, managing Jefferson's personal wardrobe and rooms. This was her daily labor for 37 years, inside a household whose owner was also, by any modern definition, the father of 4 of her surviving children. There's no evidence she ever spoke publicly about any of it. There's no letter in her own hand, and no confirmed record that she could write at all, though she could likely read. If she ever left a personal account of her own life, it hasn't survived. What survives instead is a ledger, a will, and one interview her son gave 47 years after Jefferson's death, the closest thing to her own voice that history has left us. By 1826, the dates on that private agreement from Paris had started coming due, one at a time. Beverly and Harriet, the 2 eldest surviving children, left Monticello in the early 1820s. Not formally freed on paper, simply allowed to walk away and never pursued, which was Jefferson's quiet way of honoring a promise he had never put in writing. Both were light-skinned enough to enter white society undetected. To survive, both appear to have cut all contact with the family that raised them, disappearing from the historical record so completely that neither is confirmed to have acknowledged their origins again. That was the actual price of the freedom their mother negotiated. Not just liberty, but total severance from everyone and everything they had known. Jefferson died on July 4, 1826, deeply in debt, more than $100,000, an enormous sum for the time. His will formally freed Madison and Eston, his 2 youngest sons with Sally Hemings, along with 3 older men from the Hemings family. It freed almost no one else. Of the roughly 130 people he enslaved at the time of his death, 5 were freed. The remaining 125 or so, including members of the extended Hemings family, were sold at public estate auction over the following months to satisfy his creditors. Sally Hemings was not named in the will. She was not freed, and she was not sold either. Jefferson's daughter, Martha Randolph, quietly allowed her to leave Monticello with an informal, unofficial freedom, sometimes called being given her time, likely to avoid an 1806 Virginia law that required any newly freed black person to leave the state within a year or risk being forcibly re-enslaved. She spent her final years living in a rented house in Charlottesville with her sons Madison and Eston, and she died there in 1835, roughly 9 years after Jefferson. Here is the fact that historians eventually did the arithmetic on. In the formal inventory taken of Jefferson's estate after his death, Sally Hemings was appraised at $50, among the lowest valuations on the entire list, roughly equivalent to the price of a used farm wagon at the time. She left no letters, no portrait, and no confirmed likeness of any kind. Her grave in Charlottesville has no headstone. Historians now believe the site lies somewhere beneath a modern parking lot near the Hemings family's old home on what is now West Main Street, but the exact location was never marked and is effectively lost. For nearly 2 centuries, the official position of Monticello and much of the historical establishment was that any relationship between Jefferson and Hemings was unproven gossip, first published by a political enemy with an obvious motive to lie, and safely dismissed. That consensus broke in 1998. A team led by geneticist Eugene Foster published a Y chromosome study in the journal Nature, comparing male line descendants of Eston Hemings, Sally's youngest son, against descendants of Jefferson's paternal uncle, since Jefferson himself left no surviving legitimate male line to test directly. The Y chromosomes matched. The same study tested descendants of the Woodson family, who had a separate, long-standing oral tradition claiming descent from Jefferson through an earlier child. That line did not match, a result that itself lent credibility to the study's methods rather than undermining them. Combined with the documentary record, Jefferson's presence at Monticello 9 months before the conception of every one of Sally Hemings' children, without a single exception across more than 2 decades, the historical consensus shifted decisively. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which operates Monticello, now states in its own official research and public materials that Jefferson was almost certainly the father of all 6 of Sally Hemings' children. The shift wasn't purely scientific. Years before the DNA results, a legal historian named Annette Gordon-Reed had already published a book, in 1997, methodically laying out why generations of Jefferson scholars had dismissed the Hemings family's own oral tradition while accepting far thinner evidence for other historical claims involving white subjects. Her argument wasn't that the relationship was proven beyond doubt. It was that historians had applied a different standard of evidence to black testimony than to white testimony, and that the Hemings family's consistent, decades-old account deserved to be weighed on its own merits rather than waved away by default. When the DNA results arrived the following year, they didn't just answer a genealogical question. They vindicated a specific argument about whose memory gets believed. Monticello's own reckoning followed slowly. The site's research committee issued a formal report in 2000 acknowledging the high likelihood of the relationship. The Getting Word African American Oral History Project, launched in 1993, spent years locating and recording descendants of Monticello's enslaved community, including Hemings' descendants, building an archive of family memory to sit alongside Jefferson's own meticulous paperwork. It took until 2017 for the physical space itself to catch up. The small room off the South Terrace, stripped of its plumbing fixtures and restored to its probable 18th century footprint, reopened the following year as a dedicated exhibit on Sally Hemings' life, not a footnote inside a tour of Jefferson's. She used the only leverage she ever held, a few years in a country where the law briefly treated her as human, to buy a future for people who did not yet exist, at the cost of the rest of her own life. It's not in any collection at Monticello, and it can't be photographed, and it may be the largest thing anyone ever carried out of that house. There are more stories like this one waiting. Stories about the small, human decisions, a guard's drink, a wife's preference, a nervous man's lost courage, that quietly decided the fate of an entire nation. Be here for them. Subscribe, comment, and I will see you on the next one. Thank you for watching.